بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين أما بعد. So from the overall seerah we split it, the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ while he's in Makkah into broadly, very broadly, two sections. So the first 3 years was when he was giving dawah privately, he was not going public with his dawah. Then we had this transformation when he went on Mount Safa, and suddenly this transition happened where the Prophet ﷺ no longer is quiet. Now he's going openly into the Kaaba, he's openly praying, he's openly reciting the Quran, and we notice that he gives da'wah a lot more freely. So when the Prophet ﷺ done this, there's had certain stages as well. He didn't immediately come and oppose the idols and vilify the idols. Originally the Prophet ﷺ, he would speak about Tawheed, he would talk about the fact that there's only one Allah. This is how he started. Then from speaking about Tawheed, he would come on to the things which were happening in the society which were wrong, and he would say this thing is wrong. And then finally he would come onto the idols and saying that worshipping multiple idols is also wrong. Eventually this caused problems to all of the Quraysh, and they all became very sad about this. They became very angry, and they now tried to come up with a way to stop this. So just as the Prophet ﷺ was giving da'wah towards Tawheed, and just as the Sahaba were embracing and becoming Muslims, in almost exactly the same way, this is something we don't always realize, in almost exactly the same way, the leaders of the Quraysh were opposing Islam and trying to stop Islam from spreading. Like literally, the way the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba would come in Darul Arqam, come together, think of how to bring Islam, think of how to give da'wah, the way the Prophet ﷺ would go around and call people towards Islam. In very similar ways, some of the leaders of the Quraysh would come together and have a consultation. How do we stop Islam? How do we make Islam stop spreading? How do we take control of Islam? And we already saw last lesson one of the ways in which they done this. So there's many ways they do this. We've briefly put it into three main categories. But overall, last week we saw that they came to Abu Talib and said to Abu Talib that if you don't stop him, we will wage war with you. So they tried to basically kill the Prophet ﷺ. They tried to get him. This is the first thing. So they tried to get him through Abu Talib, tried to get Abu Talib to tell him to stop, but this didn't work. Then that was the first thing. This was their whole campaign, that let's eliminate this threat. So you imagine the Prophet ﷺ, we know that, so just to chronologically understand where we are, for 3 years there was the secret call, where the Prophet ﷺ is going, and just his friends, just the people he knows. He's not going publicly. After 3 years, in the 4th year, the open call starts. Then after maybe a couple of weeks of that, we have this Abu Talib incident, where they go to Abu Talib and say, stop your nephew. Then a few months, maybe a couple of months after this, we find that the da'wah increases. The Prophet ﷺ is doing lots of da'wah. And then we have this kind of stage where we can, broadly speaking, we can categorize all of the ways which they try and stop Islam from spreading. So generally the last one on this list, we've got 1, 2 and 3. The last one, which is physically abusing people, this came last. And then the other two, propagating misinformation and ridiculing, these came kind of at the beginning. We already know that propagating misinformation basically means they lie about Islam. We'll see some of that today. And another thing is that they mock and disassociate from the Muslims. We'll see some of that today. And also we'll even see some of the last part today as well, in one of the stories which we see as well, that they actually physically abuse one of the Muslims for reciting the Quran. But obviously now the Quraysh have this campaign. Just like the Muslims have a campaign to bring people to Islam, the Quraysh have a campaign to take people away from Islam. In fact, from the very first few narrations that we mentioned, when the Prophet ﷺ is going around calling people to Tawheed, Abu Lahab, his own uncle, is following him around as well, and he's giving his own da'wah. The Prophet ﷺ is giving one da'wah, saying, Qulu la ilaha illallah, say la ilaha illallah, tuflihu, become successful. And behind him, you have Abu Lahab coming, saying that don't listen to this man, he's left the deen of his forefathers, he's a traitor, he's a rebel, do not listen to him. And in some narrations it says he's a madman. So we find the difference there, that they're both giving da'wah towards something, they're both calling towards something. So this is how we find right from the beginning of Islam, there were actual physical campaigns. That's just from one uncle. So obviously what happened is this idea of calling towards Islam, the idea of calling towards Allah was made haram. It was made against the law. And this is a very obvious thing. So this may seem simple, but again, if you think now the law of Makkah, because the leaders of the Quraysh make the law, they've said if you call towards Islam, if you recite the Quran in public, if you publicly give da'wah, you're breaking the law. You will be punished. This is essentially what they said. So now these people, whoever would be engaged, the Prophet ﷺ himself was engaged in this. So now whenever he would do this, they would make it very clear that what he's doing is not something which is going to be acceptable in their society. So anybody that does that then feels that they're left out of society. This is how everybody's made to feel. This is how very targeted approach that they take. To make it seem like an undesirable action. To be with the Muslims is undesirable. You're the public enemy. Prophet ﷺ was considered to be public enemy number one from everyone. They felt that if they could get rid of him, they'd solve all of their problems. Everybody that's associated with him was public enemy number two in the order of influence that they have on Islam. That's how they worked in that area. So one thing specifically is that they banned the Quran and reciting of the Quran. So we know the Prophet ﷺ would come and he'd recite the Quran, and we notice sometimes people come to him and as a response he'd recite the Quran. So now the Prophet ﷺ would go in the Kaaba and recite the Quran, and now even from the Quran ayah we notice that the Prophet ﷺ, he would recite the Quran, and the mushrikeen would, in order to drown out his voice, to make sure nobody can hear him, they will start reciting other things. They will start making a noise and din and talking loudly so that nobody can hear the Quran. So this happened so much that it became a rule of the Kaaba that you're not allowed to read Quran here. And if the Prophet ﷺ ever recited the Quran, almost immediately they would drown him out and say, no, don't listen. To the extent that sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would then raise his voice with the Quran. And then when he would raise his voice, then he would try and compete almost with the din that's going on. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions in the verse in the Quran, وَلَا تَجْهَرْ بِصَلَاتِكَ وَلَا تُخَافِتْ بِهَا, that don't tajhar, don't be so loud with your tilawah, and don't be completely silent with it. One narration says that this is when the Prophet ﷺ was leading the Sahaba in Salah, and then he was reciting the Quran in the Salah, and then other people, when they heard the Quran, they used to make sure nobody can hear. They used to start cursing the Quran. They used to curse man nazalahu, man anzalahu. They used to curse the Quran, the person who revealed the Quran, and the person upon who the Quran was revealed. So they would curse, na'udhu billah, they'd curse the Quran, they'd curse Allah, and they'd curse the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is, if you look at the tafsir of this verse, we find this. We find this one narration. We find another narration where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would recite the Quran, and they would be so loud that nobody can hear him. So the Prophet ﷺ would go louder as well. So that says, لا تجهر بصلاته, you do not need to raise your voice. Just recite it in a normal voice, and whoever wants to listen will listen. And in fact, this crazy thing which we kind of see is that the leaders of the Quraysh themselves banned the Quran. But what's amazing is that they themselves would then, and this is a very well narrated incident, that the leaders themselves would go at night to try and listen to the Quran. So this proves that the Quran was banned. It was not allowed to recite the Quran in the Kaaba. So now the Quraysh themselves made this ban, but they themselves, they heard a little bit here and there, and they loved it so much that three leaders of the Quraysh, Abu Jahl, Abu Sufyan, and Akhnas bin Shurayk, all three of them, obviously two of them known to, Abu Jahl didn't become Muslim, but the other two are known to, obviously Abu Sufyan became Muslim, Akhnas, most people say he became Muslim as well. Akhnas was very soft from the beginning on Islam. So anyway, so the three came at night time, Prophet ﷺ praying tahajjud. So when he's praying tahajjud in his house, he's reciting the Quran to an extent that if somebody listens carefully they can hear it. And sometimes he would pray in the Kaaba. So they would come and try and listen to the Quran. Three people. So now obviously they're not coming together. This is not a conspiracy. They would come themselves. They would come individually. Abu Jahl would come himself, and then Abu Sufyan would come himself, and they'd all come from their own ways. So they wouldn't meet up, and they'd come from their own alleyways. So when they would listen, then on their way back, what happened one night is that they bumped into each other, all three of them. And they all just asked each other, what are you doing here? And they all made excuses that we just come, for a walk 4 o'clock in the morning. So they all just made excuses. Nobody said anything. Nobody admitted at that time. And then they said, okay, we're not going to do this again. Then second night, same thing happens. They meet each other. Third night, they meet each other and they make a promise that, we are not going to come back. But just think, sometimes to internalize the reality of this, the Prophet ﷺ, tahajjud. So it's before Fajr time. You don't usually wake up early. I mean, many of us may make aims to wake up early, and some of us may go to the gym, some of us will meditate, some of us will come for Fajr in the masjid, waking up early. We do amazing things when we wake up early. They're waking up extra early to go and listen to the Quran, which they are banning in their own city. Imagine how much they like the Quran. Obviously, the one main reason they have behind this is because, unfortunately, we don't have this privilege, but they had the privilege of listening to Rasulullah ﷺ himself reciting the Quran. So it would have been extra special. But the people who hated Islam, who used to curse the Quran, these same people are coming to listen to the Quran because they love to hear what's being said. So this is how much power that the Quran had. And then Akhnas, in fact, he was the softest, so he felt the effect of the Quran. Obviously, if you're going to be this affected by a book, that you come out of your house early morning before Fajr time to go and stand outside, and there's no audience there, there's no comfortable seating, you're just standing there listening to the Prophet ﷺ. And obviously it's a little bit cold at that time, just to do all of this, obviously they're going to realize that this Quran is special. So Akhnas realized. Then he went to Abu Sufyan. And he asked Abu Sufyan that, what do you think about the Quran? What do you think about it? So Abu Sufyan, like a child, he goes, and I'm not going to tell you, you tell me first. So Abu Sufyan said this, that you tell me first. Because obviously they are the politicians. They can't say anything. So Abu Sufyan didn't say anything. Akhnas said, I think it's the truth. Then Abu Sufyan, because he was a very political person, he didn't say anything really. He just said, I don't think it's... He said something very vague. And he didn't say, I think it's the truth or it's a lie, but he just said, I think it's, interesting, basically. Then Akhnas also went to Abu Jahl. And this incident where he went to Abu Jahl is narrated a couple of times. Once by Akhnas, and another person narrates the same thing. The reason Abu Jahl didn't become Muslim. So he goes to Abu Jahl, he goes that, what do you think of the Quran? Abu Jahl, he then said, Abu Jahl was from Banu Makhzum, which you remember, Banu Makhzum were the tribe who decided, when the Kaaba was being rebuilt, they said that we will fight for the black stone. Unless we put it in the place, we will have a big fight. So Banu Makhzum, this is Abu Jahl's tribe. And obviously Abu Sufyan is from the Banu Umayyah. So these are the three main tribes. We have the Banu Umayyah, which is Abu Sufyan, and then we have Banu Makhzum, which is Abu Jahl. So Abu Jahl now, he says that we and Banu Hashim obviously the tribe of Rasulullah ﷺ. So Banu Hashim and Banu Makhzum, Abu Jahl says that our two tribes have always been fighting against each other. And if you remember again, that when Banu Hashim, the great-grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ, Abdul Muttalib's father, he was very generous, and then the other person from Umayyah, they used to have a competition with him to try and give more. So there's always been competition between the tribes. So Abu Jahl said, we've always had close competition with Banu Hashim. But when somebody from Banu Hashim claims prophethood, then how can we compete with that? How can we compete with somebody who claims to be a prophet? So if we accept him, we're going to have to accept defeat. The only way we can continue competing is if we say that he's not a prophet and we deny his revelation, and that way we stay in the game, basically. If you have to accept and concede that somebody else has divine revelation in another tribe, you've lost, but you're going to have to follow him. So because of this arrogance, he didn't want to follow. This is the reason he gave to Akhnas came when they all three found each other, and they all knew that we've all come to listen to the Quran. So Akhnas went the next day to ask Abu Jahl, what do you think of the Quran? Abu Jahl says that I think it's true, but we cannot follow him because this will end our competition. This is the reason that he gave. So Abu Jahl, and this is interesting thing. So obviously all three, they understood the Quran. They understood the power of the Quran. They understood how much the Quran had an effect on them, and how much the Quran really, it's just something which they themselves enjoyed so much that they went all the way there to listen to the Prophet ﷺ at that time. So this is something which just to do with the Quran itself. Now the Quran being banned is proven from this, that it's not allowed to read the Quran. So the Prophet ﷺ, we done last week as well, he tried to read the Quran sometimes, and he would make other people listen to it. And in fact, it was these were one of the reasons why people said that don't listen to him, because everybody used to feel so affected by the Quran. So they would say that, if you go and listen to the Quran, you'll be affected, he'll do magic on you. That's how they would feel. And we'll do that later as well. How people used to use this excuse that when they used to feel spiritually enlightened by the Quran, they used to say, oh, it's actually magic happening here. So this is the main thing up to here, that the Prophet ﷺ is calling openly, and then this is one thing which they use, is that they banned the reciting of the Quran, even though they understood the value of the Quran there. The next thing on the back is we find is that because the Quran was banned from being recited, Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh, once all the Sahaba, they came together in Dar Arqam, and they were discussing that for a long time nobody's read the Quran in the Kaaba, because when the Prophet ﷺ was there, everybody's ready to drown him out. Nobody really listens. So this is, somebody else should go and recite the Quran, and when they recite the Quran, then everybody will listen to the Quran being recited. This will be very good. So now the one person who put themselves forward was Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh.